James Bultema, President of the Ulysses S. Grant Association and Presidential Library, and I want to welcome you to this, our second video newsletter. One of the things I'm doing as your new president is membership. The board has elected a chair to our membership committee, John Sampson, and we're looking at things that we can do to make sure that the membership is getting as much out of the organization as possible. One of the things we're looking at is a book club, and John will talk later about that in this video, so I want you to take a look at that. If you have any suggestions what we can do to make membership more rewarding for you, please shoot me an email, and we sure will look into it. We're wide open to suggestions. I just believe in communication and getting the word out, and that's part of the reason for this video newsletter. Also, in the past, we've always had one board meeting. We're going to have a second board meeting at the end of this month, October, and there's so much business to be done, and we have such great members on our board. I thought it important that we have this board meeting, and it'll be the largest one in attendance we've ever had. 15 out of the 16 board members will take part. So I'm excited about that, and I'll report back later what we get accomplished. And so now let's get started with our video newsletter.
Hello and greetings from the Grant Presidential Library. We've been very busy here hosting both researchers and visitors to the museum, and our numbers, we are happy to report, continue to inch up from their pre-pandemic level. In September, we hosted nearly 500 visitors, which is more than we've had in the last couple of years. So we're very excited about that. We've also been hosting some very high-profile visitors as well, including Mississippi State University's head football coach, Mike Leach, who came to see us back in August. You may have seen reports of his visit on our Twitter and Facebook feeds. We've also had folks from ESPN come by and take some shots and footage of the museum that they have used during one of our football games a few weeks ago. And just last week, we hosted some members of Mississippi Senator Cindy Hyde-Smith's congressional staff. And we were particularly excited to host these people because they were the folks who helped secure us a $20 million appropriation that passed through Congress last March, which is designated to help us build a brand new freestanding Grant Presidential Library. So some of you may have seen news of this and media mentions that we're sort of passing back in March. And we haven't really talked a lot about the details of this project because, quite frankly, we don't really know a whole lot. We haven't made an official announcement, and neither has Mississippi State University. You guys are getting this information straight from me just because you are members of the Ulysses S. Grant Association. But what we do know is that the money is coming to us through the National Archives and Records Administration, or NARA, who will send the money to Mississippi State to construct the building. We don't know a lot else. We don't know anything about the timeline or the details or how large the facility will be, but we are pretty excited about what we do know, which is that this will be in a very advantageous location here in Starkville. It's going to be highly visible when people come into town. It is in a prime location, and it's going to have lots of parking, so it's going to make our museum and library much more visible and much more accessible to lots of people. So we're very excited about this. And rest assured, we will share more information with y'all as it becomes available. Last but not least, I wanted to mention that we are working on some new merchandise in our gift shop. Our first edition is a new t-shirt which features some of Grant's greatest Western theater victories. This t-shirt would make a great holiday gift for you or for that special Grant fan in your life. Goodbye for now and enjoy the rest of Grant's bicentennial year.
for this video newsletter is John Sampson, and he is our new membership chair, so someone that you should be hearing from, as he's got a lot of ideas, and one of those has to do with a book club. And John, can you tell us about that, please?
Yeah, we given with our theme of trying to get members more involved in the association, suggestion was made to form a book club to meet periodically to discuss grant-related books, Grant's life, the Civil War era. And we thought we would run it past the members to gauge the level of interest in having a book club meeting by Zoom, of course, maybe every 2 months. Pick a book and then meet 2 months later to discuss it, exchange ideas, questions, and we just thought it'd be a good way to get the members more active in the association.
John, have you given any thought to what the first book might be for our members to read?
I thought maybe to use the initial book for discussion to pick one of the better, more recent biographies. And my thought was Ron White's American Ulysses would be a good book to read. Given Ron's participation in the association in the past and the good reception that his biography has received from critics and historians, I thought that would be a good book to start with. It's readily available, obviously still being in print, so members could probably obtain a copy at their local library or buy a paperback edition of the book at a relatively inexpensive cost.
John, do you have some specific ideas you're going to share with the members as you form this book club, as far as what you're going to read and how often you'll meet, that sort of thing?
The thought was after the initial meeting, we can discuss where we want to go from there. If we want to limit the future books to grant-related material specifically, or open it up to the Civil War, mid-19th century, Americana, whatever the interest is for the majority of the group. Some of the books on Grant, especially some of the older ones that are well received, are out of print. So it's could be difficult for everybody to find a copy. So by opening it up to a broader genre, it would make it easier to facilitate their obtaining a copy and having 2 months to read it. So that's something we could discuss at the first meeting.
This segment, Grant was here. I'm interviewing Tim Welch, President and CEO of the Ulysses S. Grant Historical Site since 2009. Tim began his career in communications as a reporter and anchor on radio and TV news in Albany. He is the founder of Welch Communications, which specializes in media relations, video productions, and branding for small businesses and regional political campaigns. Tim also is a college professor specializing in media and communication studies. So Tim, can you tell us about the U.S. Grant Cottage Historical Site?
Very good, James. Thanks for the opportunity to talk about Grant Cottage, which by my way of thinking is quite a story that we have to tell, because we have the man who saved the Union, spent the last 6 weeks of his life at Grant Cottage, which is in northern Saratoga County in upstate New York.
I understand that recently the Grant Cottage was made a National Historical Landmark. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, James, one of the most interesting developments in the past year, actually 18 months ago, we were officially designated as a National Historic Landmark. And you can say, well, why did it take that long? And that's a good question. But one of the reasons we were able to become a National Historic Landmark was that we were able to prove that we've been able to create a time capsule of 1885, the summer of 1885 in upstate New York. We had that Civil War connection thanks to Grant's appearance there and his death there. And what we've been able to do is to keep all the original furniture that was there when the great man visited there and died. That includes the bed he died on, the two chairs that are opposing chairs because he couldn't lay down because of the throat cancer. He would choke. So he slept, he ate, he did everything sitting up, and he put two opposing chairs together, which you'll be able to see pictures of on the screen. And he would do his writing and his note taking at that time. He would even take some broth or something when he was there. And that's when you'll also see a cabinet with the vial of cocaine water that his two doctors used to bathe his throat to give him some relief from the throat cancer. You'll see a room that has the clock that his son stopped at exactly 10 minutes after 8 on the 23rd of July, 1885, when he drew his last breath. This was kind of a Victorian tradition where you stopped the family clock in the death room. You'll see a room where we have preserved the floral arrangements, which were sent by, well, one of them was sent by the George Meade Post in Philadelphia. You know Meade, the hero of Gettysburg. Now, Meade actually died a year before Grant, but his GAR Post sent this beautiful arrangement of flowers, and there are a couple of others in this room, and they were preserved in beeswax. So they look old, but they're pretty much, they sort of look like the day they were delivered a couple days after Grant died in the summer of 1885. So we have those things preserved. We have the chair that you see with the last picture of Grant taken on the 20th of July, 1885. There's a picture of Grant reading the newspaper in his slippers, wearing a top hat and a big scarf around his neck because he had a huge growth coming out of the side of his neck, which he covered up with a scarf. And you see him 3 days before he died with the last photograph of Grant on the porch. That chair is inside Grant Cottage that he sat on. So we really have a time capsule of 1885 preserved absolutely and methodically.
And Tim, what do you see for the future of the cottage?
The prison was closed in 2014, and we have been lobbying over the past 8 years to try to get the prisoner ball field, which I'll be able to show you pictures of. We were deeded that just earlier this year. We were deeded the 4.2 acre recreation yard for the prisoners. And we're going to, one of the things that when you come to the gala, James, on October 16th, that is a fundraiser that we're kicking off during this 200th year of Grant's birthday, where we're raising money to build an educational pavilion and to expand our parking for Grant Cottage. Grant did indeed conquer death and poverty in his final battle on Mount McGregor in Saratoga County.
In this segment of talking of Grant and photographs, we're going to talk about the very last photograph of Grant ever taken. Diagnosed with throat cancer in 1884, oppressive heat in New York City forced the suffering general to move to a mountain cottage of a friend, Joseph W. Drexel, at Mount McGregor, New York, where he arrived on June 16th, 1885. A New York World newspaper correspondent reported from Mount McGregor, quote, photographer W.H. Baker from Saratoga Springs came up with a big camera in the afternoon and succeeded in getting 4 good views of the family group of 9 as they sat on the piazza. The plates are 22 by 28 inches, a considerable size for that style of work. The general sat through it all unwarily and seemed interested in the work. John Gilman of New York took these last images of Grant on July 18th, 1885. At least 4 photographs were taken that Wednesday. Several identifiers tie these images together. They are Grant's clothes, the position of his cane on the chair to his left, the chair to his right with 2 spittoons on them, and the door being opened. For each succeeding image, Gilman moved his camera closer to Grant. They were undoubtedly shot in this following order. The first image is a wide shot of Grant on the porch reading his newspaper while others are off to the side. Next, Gilman moved his camera closer for another view. As Grant changed the newspaper's position, he dropped a cloth on the wood deck. Grant's aide, Harrison Terrell, moves into the doorway to watch the proceedings. Terrell, an African American, was very close to the general. While near death, Grant managed to write a letter of recommendation for Terrell. Gilman next decided to move his camera for a second time, now even closer to Grant, who paid him no attention and continued to read his newspaper. He snapped another last photograph. Terrell now sits in the doorway, but as these last 3 images are almost identical with the exact printed text, copyright date, and the primary subject, Grant, remaining sedentary, this little historical fact has escaped historians, including this author, until a research trip to Mississippi State University. While going through Julia Grant's collection at the Grant Presidential Library, another last photograph was discovered. In this one, Harrison Terrell is now much more in focus and is staring at the camera while Grant has unfolded the newspaper and is reading it at full width. The support pillar for the porch now frames the left side of the image while the full doorway is more exposed. Gilman then added his copyright using the same printed text size and cardstock, identifying this as the last photograph of Grant. With this discovery, the movements of Gilman form a precise record of the final 4 images of Grant. But the close-up of Grant is truly the last photograph of General Grant and the most circulated. For this video, I want to introduce Frank Scaturro, who I know from, since he was almost a teenager back in the day, and I've watched him accomplish so much in his life and made sure to get him on our board of directors. But I want to tell you a little bit about him and his past. Frank is an attorney and a writer, a graduate of the Columbia University and Penn Law School. He served as counsel for the Constitution for the Senate Judiciary Committee from 2005 to 2009. Afterwards, he taught classes at Hofstra Law School on constitutional law and the legislative process. He's the founder and president of the Grant Monument Association. That's where I first met him. Frank fought a failed government bureaucracy and pushed for a $2 million restoration of Grant's tomb. Frank has published a number of books and articles in the area of history and law, including President Grant Reconsidered and the Supreme Court's Retreat from Reconstruction. He is a past Republican candidate for Congress in New York's 4th Congressional District, and during the 114th Congress, he served as special counsel to the House Select Investigative Panel. He currently serves as vice president and senior counsel for the Judicial Crisis Network. He is also co-editing Grant at 200, a collection of essays about Ulysses S. Grant, to be published during his 200th birthday observance this year.
Okay, well, thank you, Jim. Thanks for having me. It's so great to be with you and with fellow members of the Ulysses S. Grant Association for this video newsletter. I'm looking forward to many more of them.
Frank, what were the issues facing the country when Grant became president, and how did he handle them?
So when Grant became president, a terrible civil war had, of course, recently taken place, and that presented several serious challenges for the government. Arguably, the most serious was a central question of Reconstruction. What would the status be of people who had been enslaved but were recently emancipated? former Confederate states were doing all they could to relegate formerly enslaved people to a status that very closely resembled slavery. And they were aided in this by Andrew Johnson, Lincoln's successor. He opposed a number of measures to advance equal rights, but they were passed nonetheless by a veto-proof majority of Congress. Under the congressionally authorized system of military reconstruction, the former Confederate states were to ratify the 14th Amendment to the Constitution and to give African Americans the right to vote. But from the beginning, there was intense and often violent resistance to this among white Southerners. Grant was reluctant to accept the Republican Party's nomination to the presidency, but his reason for overcoming his reluctance, as he told his friend General Sherman, was the need in the South for, this is a quote, some strong power to protect the Negroes and Union men against legal oppression or the acts of badly disposed ex-rebels. Now, that a federal constitutional amendment would be necessary to confer and protect the right to vote regardless of race was highlighted by the Georgia state legislature's expulsion of its Black members in September 1868, only months after adopting a constitution that guaranteed Black voting rights. A 15th Amendment providing a constitutional guarantee against racial discrimination in voting was proposed by the House and Senate within a week before Grant's inauguration on March 4th, 1869. But ratification by the states would take nearly another year and was far from a foregone conclusion. Now, Grant urged ratification in his first inaugural address. He signed legislation that required ratification by the states still under military rule. He made appeals individually to states, and he arm twisted when it was necessary. That included breaking an impasse about Georgia, requesting its temporary return to military rule until the state ratified the 15th Amendment. Grant then, following the ratification of the 15th Amendment, secured the rest of the legal architecture behind the federal guarantee of equal rights, the statute establishing the Department of Justice, 5 enforcement acts that protected 14th and 15th Amendment rights, and the first desegregation law of national scope, the Civil Rights Act of 1875. His infant Justice Department prosecuted the Ku Klux Klan and crushed that organization by 1872. Now, Grant, as president, repeatedly made public statements embracing equality, including when he advocated in 1875, this is another quote, equal right and privileges to all men, irrespective of nationality, color, or religion. No president before him ever endorsed a full accommodation of such a wide range of people into the scheme of American democracy. Now, the aftermath of the Civil War also brought serious economic challenges. The demands of fighting the war left the most serious fiscal problems the government had ever faced, with an unprecedented national debt of more than $2 billion when Grant was inaugurated. The war had also given rise to new kinds of currency unbacked by specie, gold or silver, and that left contentious questions of monetary policy. So Grant successfully took on the fiscal challenges. He refinanced and substantially reduced an unprecedented national debt while he cut taxes by $300 million. He stopped a panic that was triggered by an attempt to corner the gold market in his first term. During his second term, the country was hit with a panic that led to a serious depression. That point is often brought out in histories of his presidency without noting what followed. In 1875, he secured gold resumption that would take effect in 1879. Once that took effect, there was a surge of business confidence accompanied by an abrupt end to the Depression. Now, on another front, Grant elevated the reform of the government's policy toward Native Americans to a new level of urgency in the face of their impending extermination under the status quo. The nominal reservation system in place offered little protection in the face of the string of broken treaties, the repeated removal of tribes, the stampede of settlers and explorers to the West in unprecedented numbers, the disappearance of the Indian frontier, the periodic battles and massacres, and the corrupt and exploitative Indian service that could not be trusted to protect Indian welfare. What became known as Grant's peace policy emphasized fair dealing and humane treatment and made the federal government directly responsible for the welfare of Native Americans as individuals, departing from a treaty paradigm that too often treated tribes like foreign adversaries. Even beyond that, Grant aimed for their ultimate citizenship. Now, much of his program was assimilationist. On reservations, Native Americans were to be taught agricultural methods and provided sufficient means at reasonable costs to pursue them. Over the course of Grant's presidency, a number of medical and educational programs were established for their relief. Housing, schools, teachers, cultivated land, and livestock for Native Americans would multiply. Tons of food, clothing, and books were donated by churches and Indian aid organizations. Commentators today tend to paint the 19th century goal of assimilation with a broad brush of condemnation. But Grant's contemporary critics tended to accuse him of being too lenient and protective toward Native Americans, as he embraced the most humanitarian views on the political spectrum of his time. Grant also faced several challenges abroad. On 3 occasions, he averted threats of war with Spain and Great Britain while maintaining the country's honor. You take the resolution of the Alabama claims controversy with Great Britain, which was just one component of a much broader foreign policy achievement. The CSS Alabama was the most famous of several Confederate ships that were constructed in and set sail from British ports during the Civil War. And although they were built in private shipyards, the British government allowed these ships to escape and inflict a great deal of destruction to Union merchant shipping. After the war, Americans demanded reparations, and the quarrel between the two countries presented the most menacing situation between them since the War of 1812. The terms of settlement of the dispute were provided by the Treaty of Washington, which was signed in 1871 by members of the Joint High Commission appointed by Grant and by the British government. The Alabama claims would be resolved through arbitration by a tribunal that would convene in Geneva and in 1872 award the United States $15.5 million in damages. The treaty also provided for the settlement of a number of other disputes between the United States and Great Britain. Besides marking a turning point in Anglo-American relations and well beyond the immediate importance of the award to the United States, the settlement of the Alabama claims established the principle of international arbitration for the resolution of disputes between nations involving questions of paramount importance. The peaceful submission of this major controversy to arbitration demonstrated to other nations an alternative to war that would provide an unprecedented impetus toward world peace. Grant's diplomatic triumph led to several organized efforts that promoted alternatives to war, including the Hague Conventions of 1899 and 1907, and years later, the League of Nations and the United Nations. Another crisis worth highlighting is the Virginius affair. In 1873, the Virginius, a steamer commanded by a US citizen and flying the American flag, was captured by the Spanish gunboat Tornado. Claiming that the vessel was aiding Cuban rebels, Spanish military authorities executed 53 prisoners, including Fry and many other Americans. Grant and Fish resisted pressure to declare war on Spain and secured a peaceful resolution of the crisis, including the release of surviving captives and ultimately an $80,000 indemnity from the Spanish government. An investigation into the matter had revealed that the Virginius was illegally registered and had no right to fly the American flag. Grant ended his presidency with yet another major achievement, ensuring the orderly and peaceful inauguration of a new president following the threats that mounted during the electoral crisis of 1876 to 77. That achievement was made possible by public recognition of Grant's character, his firmness, and his respect for the law. This affirms just how important character can be to the presidency.
Frank, why were historians so negative in their assessment of Grant's presidency for so long?
So Grant did suffer a very negative assessment for much of the 20th century. In fact, he was ranked second to rock bottom Warren Harding in the first polls of experts ranking the presidents in 1948 and 1962, and again in an even larger poll in 1982. The historian William Heseltine, who was quite negative on Grant in his own book written in 1935, said that Grant's enemies had stuffed the ballot boxes of history. Now that captures part of the reason for Grant's low standing. Many members of the New England intellectual elite of the time, not to mention other influential writers and newspaper editors, condemned Grant. Henry Adams was the most prominent. Some other examples were Charles Eliot Norton, Charles A. Dana, James Wilson, Horace White, and Grant's opponent for a re-election in 1872, Horace Greeley. A good number of these critics had an axe to grind after realizing that neither they nor their friends would gain position or influence in the administration, at least not to the degree to which they felt entitled. They were also imbued with a class-based prejudice that marred their perception of Grant. Henry Adams anticipated a reign of Western mediocrity before Grant was even inaugurated. But a deeper reason for historians' low assessment of Grant was opposition to what he stood for and what political faction he stood with. The biggest factor, I think, is the myth of the lost cause and its offshoot, the Dunning School. The 20th century's long dominant Dunning School of history worked from racially invidious premises to excoriate those who were responsible for Reconstruction. This school derided Grant for being rigid in enforcing the 14th and 15th Amendments. Another trend was the economic tradition that became particularly pronounced during the New Deal. When the study of Grant's presidency by William Heseltine and another major study by Alan Nevins came out, it was the height of the New Deal, and neither author showed much compunction about viewing with partisan hostility the contrasting economic policy of what then had been the only Republican administration of 2 full terms. The studies were less an objective analysis of those years and more a foil by which to validate the later progressive and New Deal eras. The climate, which is typified by Matthew Josephson's book, The Robber Barons, lampooned the Gilded Age as a period of predation by concentrated wealth. Historians made few distinctions between the early and late Gilded Age, let alone did they consider whether their methodology was ahistorical. Those who continue to sweep the Grant administration into blanket condemnations of supposed Gilded Age economic oppression overlook that the period between 1870 and 1940 witnessed a more dramatic improvement in Americans' standard of living than any other period in history, conditions that encouraged massive waves of immigration of those who sought a better future in America. Now, another trend is the way the civil service reform movement would be conducted and remembered in history. Grant did more to bring reform to the executive branch of government than perhaps any of his predecessors, but he was also an ally of prominent practitioners of the long-standing spoils system who were skeptical of a particular priority of Gilded Age reformers to change the way appointments were made. Now, popular fervor for civil service reform, at least of the kind sought by Gilded Age reformers, did not arise until after James Garfield's assassination in 1881 at the hands of an insane office seeker, which was cynically exploited by advocates to advance the cause. What followed was the adoption of a permanent merit system in the civil service starting in 1883. Now, if you believe the triumphalist history of the merit system, you would think that its adoption meant that it made waste, inefficiency, and corruption in the federal government a thing of the past. Of course, that is not the case, but instead of conducting a properly nuanced analysis of the issue or sufficiently acknowledging how Grant laid the groundwork for reform, Grant and his allies are once again treated as a foil, the dark ages that preceded the age of reform. What's interesting about all of these trends is that the contempt for Grant as president is so deeply rooted in the historical profession that for much of the 20th century, he became a sort of Rorschach test for negative assessment, even when the premise of historical analysis changed 180 degrees. So take Reconstruction. In 1961, even a top legal mind like Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter wrote in a judicial opinion, a dissent that he wrote in a case that year, he wrote, echoing a law review article, "It is very queer to try to protect human rights in the middle of the 20th century by a leftover from the days of General Grant." That's a direct quote. And that illustrates how that contempt seemed to linger even while the premises changed. So if you get to C. Vann Woodward, who many consider the greatest historian of the 20th century, well, he's an interesting case. In 1957, he writes an article for American Heritage magazine entitled "The Lowest Ebb." And there he described Grant as presidential statesmanship at its worst. On Reconstruction, he depicted Grant as the tool of radical Republicans whom he called extremists, and he charged that Grant fell under the influence of the extremists and went over completely to their Southern policy, disillusioning moderates. But that's in 1957. But then in 1981, Woodward pulled an about-face. He then attacked Grant for his supposed hostility toward what he called the more radical war aim for Black franchise and racial equality, and he blamed Grant for the abandonment of Reconstruction. And 8 years after that, writing more generally, Woodward threw up his hands and confessed his, quote, failure to find a satisfactory explanation for the failure of Reconstruction. And he invited other historians to seek the answer. Woodward would also flip-flop on the Grant administration as a benchmark of corruption, which was a big part of the picture that he drew in 1957. In 1987, years after Watergate and in the midst of the Iran-Contra scandal during the Reagan administration, Woodward was asked to compare what was happening then with prior presidencies. And of Grant and of other Gilded Age phenomena, Woodward wrote to a historian, he said, "Our prevailing picture of the Gilded Age is preposterous, a howling anachronism. Revision, replacement, vindication, updating, call it what you will, but it is the most pressing duty facing American historians." But he himself did not have time to write that corrective, and the truth is the rest of the historical profession has been slow to do so.
Has the negative assessment of Grant's presidency changed in recent times? Is history now getting it right, in your opinion?
For all the correction that has occurred to Grant's reputation, and there has been a great deal of an upswing in his presidential standing, there are some issues out there. Now, Grant went from being rated near the rock bottom, as I said, for the first several polls of historians that were conducted during the 20th century. He was above only Warren Harding. And for the balance of the 20th century, he usually found himself ranked among the bottom 5. During the 20th century, that has improved considerably. If you look at the C-SPAN polls, which are done between 2000 was their first poll, and they conduct a poll starting in 2009. They would conduct another poll every time a new president is inaugurated. And Grant, in that poll and also in the Siena poll, really catapulted up to just above the middle mark, the midpoint. He was ranked, I believe it was number 20 in the latest C-SPAN poll of 2021. And that shows a remarkable improvement in his reputation. And if you look at the breakdown of his ranking in different areas, you could see the highest rating he would receive in promoting equal justice for all, a category that goes to Grant's civil rights accomplishments. But for all of that correction, much of the incongruous standards that long applied to Grant, I think, persists. Now, today, to be sure, no longer can a summary of the Grant administration be presented that omits Reconstruction or employs the Dunning-era condemnation of Reconstruction. But the same summary could be expected to omit with impunity the Alabama claims, the Virginius affair, and gold resumption, while it could not omit some form of the corruption narrative without seeming incomplete. It might be that historians care about Reconstruction, but less so about other issues that have been distorted. They might not realize how much distortions on other issues are the spillover effect of the polemic-infused accounts from the years when the Dunning interpretation prevailed. Presidential historians who have not focused on Grant should have tried much more than they have to apply the same judicious approach to all presidencies. So while I would say I take with a grain of salt the whole notion of ranking presidents, I don't think they're conducive to numerical ranking because there are so many differences among different administrations that many of them really can't be branded with, a single adjective assessment like great or failure or average. But there are some presidents, a few presidents who I think can be described as great. I believe that Grant is one of them for reasons that I went into. And I hope that the improvement in Grant's presidential standing doesn't stop where it is. It's encouraging that it's improved substantially, but I hope that there will be some point, and I think Grant's bicentennial is as good an occasion as any to acknowledge that Grant really belongs in the pantheon of America's best remembered presidents.
What's your take on the notion that Grant's administration was afflicted with corruption?
I would say every administration has been afflicted with some level of corruption, except for one, William Harrison, because he died after only 30 days in office. But I'll speak for a moment to what I call the corruption narrative, the notion that corruption served primarily to discredit Grant's presidency and bears primacy over policy issues. It's often forgotten that the Grant corruption narrative started out not about his subordinates, but about equating other phenomena from the spoils system to Grant's Reconstruction policy as corrupt threats to the Republican ideal. Now, the practice of the spoils system, the use of partisan criteria in the distribution of appointments, was in place for generations and was used extensively by Grant's immediate predecessors, notably including Jackson and Lincoln, and their tactics enhanced historians' perception of their success. But when Grant would use patronage power to secure his goals, that was incongruously deemed corrupt. Now, anti-Grant reformers also put under the umbrella of corruption government extravagance, defined as spending beyond the bare minimum needed to advance expenditures the critics deemed essential. Though such extravagance would be a strange charge for historians to level against a president like Grant. The federal government ran at a surplus throughout all 8 of his years in office, and appropriations declined by 25%. Grant's appointees actually introduced reforms to the largest and the most troubled realms of government, including, among other measures, new testing standards in the Treasury and Interior departments, breaking the whiskey tax evasion scheme known as the whiskey ring, and significant improvements in the operation of the Post Office Department. Perhaps most ominously, a major part of the definition of corruption held by Grant's contemporary critics was his Reconstruction policy, which they deemed a threat to what they viewed as the Republican ideal. Gilded Age critics notoriously viewed themselves as the best men who should have power, and they were repelled by what they saw as heavy-handed militaristic measures to prop up a race they did not deem fit to share that power. Criticism of Reconstruction became so fused with the corruption narrative that in 1957, C. Vann Woodward called the South the most conspicuous example of corruption during Grant's terms. But in fact, as the historian Mark Summers has observed in multiple books he has written on the subject of corruption, the post-Civil War federal government was not more corrupt than it was during the 1850s, and the period of Grant's administration did not mark a shift from honesty to depravity. The Credit Mobilier scandal is actually an example of this double standard in play. It involved the unseemly sale of shares of stock to the company that had financed the construction of the Union Pacific Railroad to several members of Congress at bargain prices. It had occurred in a different branch of government and even prior to Grant's inauguration. It was revealed in 1872 during Grant's presidency, to be sure, but of course Grant had nothing to do with it. Neither did the executive branch. Now, there were subordinates who proved unworthy during Grant's administration, but among his principal subordinates, the individual cases don't really stand out next to other esteemed presidencies, and presidential loyalty to subordinates under fire has actually been the norm in American history. Now, among Grant's cabinet or other principal appointees, it was not until his second term that opponents could find such targets, and they nearly always fell short of demonstrating the official's malfeasance. An Attorney General, George Williams, bought a fancy carriage that was used for social calls and negligently allowed the Justice Department's chief clerk to handle his personal accounts in a way that effectively resulted in improper advances in pay. But these lapses were common and did not lead to personal profit. Now, Williams's wife may have been a different story, as she was reported to have solicited a bribe. Grant's second Secretary of the Treasury, William Richardson, negligently signed off on an opportunist's profitable and, as it turned out, unnecessary contracts with his department to seek out delinquent taxes for a 50% commission. But Richardson had been deceived on what appeared to be routine and inconsequential contracts. He was not looking to profit and broke no law. Grant's second Secretary of the Interior, Columbus Delano, was blamed for his son's attempt to profit off shady surveying contracts without doing work, but the secretary himself was an honest man. Now, one of Grant's private secretaries in the White House, Orville Babcock, was indicted for conspiracy in connection with the whiskey ring. He was acquitted, not contrary to some accounts because of a deposition Grant submitted in his defense, but because the evidence against him was insufficient for conviction. Now, he was, I think, at a minimum, guilty of serious lapses in judgment, and he ended up being demoted to a position as inspector of lighthouses. But the belief that he lacked criminal intent to engage in bribery was widespread. The next three presidents after Grant kept Babcock on the federal payroll, and Chester Arthur actually nominated him for a military promotion before he died by drowning on the job. Grant's Secretary of War, William Belknap, was the one cabinet member who presented a strong case for malfeasance. What appeared, I should say, to be bribes that his wife had arranged in connection with a lucrative Indian post tradership. Contrary to the notion of Grant blindly sticking to corrupt subordinates, he quickly accepted Belknap's resignation, but a rabidly partisan Democratic House of Representatives went ahead and impeached him anyway. Ultimately, the Senate acquitted him because a substantial margin of senators thought they lacked jurisdiction over a former official. Now, Grant's critics accused him of trying to save his subordinate from being held accountable for his actions in an impeachment trial. Historians would long repeat that criticism, which is based on a premise that is demonstrably false. In no other instance in history has a cabinet member or any other executive branch appointee been impeached. In no other case has history held a president delinquent for not keeping potentially impeachment-worthy subordinates in office in order to subject them to the impeachment process. Additionally, Grant ordered his attorney general to prosecute Belknap. But while Belknap probably was guilty of at least willful blindness to the underlying transaction, the evidence left too much doubt as to his knowledge and criminal intent to convict him. So in contrast to other administrations, not one of Grant's high-level subordinates was convicted of any crime for their conduct during his presidency, and not because the president or anyone else protected them, but because, again, there was insufficient evidence. Significantly, historians have not found the misdeeds of subordinates, whether real or hyped, to be a fundamental component in the assessment of any president, unless that president was named Grant or Harding. Not coincidentally, two presidents historians long considered politically unsympathetic. Consider one rare survey of presidential misconduct originally compiled by C. Vann Woodward during the Nixon impeachment inquiry in 1974, with a dozen historians contributing individual chapters on each president. Well, one of those historians, James Banner, edited an updated version of that study in 2019. And he said, this is a direct quote, To write the history of presidencies through misconduct is completely to misconstrue the nature of presidencies. Let's take Truman's presidency as an example. Truman's presidency was one of the most corrupt in the 20th century. And Banner then continued that the real story of the Truman presidency consisted of policy issues like the Berlin airlift and the Marshall Plan. And he said, if you try to write the history of the Truman administration on the grounds of the misconduct of the White House, then you're not really writing the history of the Truman administration. And indeed, influence peddling marred a host of offices in the executive branch under Truman, including a major tax fraud conspiracy involving the bribery of government officials, which ultimately led to some high-profile criminal convictions. So there's a double standard in play. I would just to take a step back and sum up. Defining the Grant administration fundamentally by a corruption narrative is an exercise that finds its origin in brazenly partisan sources who employed a host of double standards that just don't apply when historians look at other presidencies. This narrative treats the president's own abundant integrity as a non-issue. It highlights any Gilded Age corruption that can build a lurid narrative. It disregards how removed from presidential decision-making or from the executive branch altogether actual misconduct is. It ignores whether the conduct predated the administration or whether the administration itself rooted it out. Guilt by association is fair game. Historians, like Grant's contemporary critics, long treated innuendo like established fact and downgraded errors in judgment to malfeasance. When Grant's subordinates went after corruption or pursued other reformative measures with his knowledge and support, they detached credit from the president. When a subordinate misstepped, they assigned the president blame, even though the conduct occurred out of presidential sight and was divorced from presidential directives. In short, historians layered hostile inference upon hostile inference to reach the most hostile conclusion.
Frank, did Grant want to be president, or was he fulfilling his duty to the country as he saw it?
Yes, I think that Grant was reluctant to become president, and this was reflected in a conversation he had with his friend General Sherman in 1868. He said he didn't want to be president. $50 million could not compensate him for becoming president, but events might force him to do so in spite of his inclination. And he talked about the former slaves in the South and Union men, there, as he described them, their allies, who were in need of protection. Grant had fought, he had led the masses of armies in the Union cause of the Civil War and the American cause, keeping the country together and securing emancipation. And he viewed by 1868 that change in government, that change that was affected by the Civil War, to be something that had to be completed and saved. He thought that the results of the war, the fruits of victory, these are phrases that occur both in the year when Grant is running for president, if you look at his correspondence with various people, and then years after, even following his presidency. A top concern of his is that the fruits of victory be preserved. And for him, that includes not only the restoration of the former Confederate states to the Union, graduating from that period of military rule, and of course, reconciliation with former Confederates who only a few years earlier had been fighting to the death on the battlefield, but it fundamentally included making emancipation a full reality with equal citizenship, with the right to vote that would be protected regardless of race. It was one of the monumental developments in the history of American democracy. That was Grant's priority, and he was in effect punished in the history books for not sharing the priority of so many historians who were then down on Reconstruction through much of the 20th century.
You've written a bit on the Constitution in general, and with respect to Grant specifically. How did Grant's contributions to the Constitution distinguish him as president?
I think that President Grant belongs in the pantheon of best remembered presidents, and what he did during Reconstruction is part of the reason why. Now, while the Constitution does not assign presidents a direct role in the ratification of constitutional amendments, presidents can still use the power they do have to secure them. The most foundational constitutional developments in which presidents played a significant role were those of the founding and of the Civil War Reconstruction era. 3 presidents in particular played such a role: Washington, Lincoln, and Grant. Now, another transformation in constitutional understanding certainly occurred during Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal, but that is a separate discussion as it did not arise from the adoption or amendment of the Constitution. Now, as the first president, George Washington provided form to the office that the Constitution created. The Civil War Reconstruction era saw the ratification of 3 new sweeping amendments to the Constitution, the first and last of which came about with significant presidential intervention. The 13th Amendment, which Lincoln helped move through Congress before its ratification by the states was consummated in December of 1865, prohibited slavery and involuntary servitude. The 14th Amendment, among other things, established both national and state citizenship for people born or naturalized in the United States and guaranteed the equal protection of the laws. That was ratified in 1868 without any help from Lincoln's successor, Andrew Johnson, who opposed measure after measure to protect former slaves advanced by radical Republicans in Congress, including the temporary military rule enacted over the president's veto and overseen by Grant as the Army's commanding general. Then, as we saw, the 15th Amendment was ratified within a year of Grant's inauguration, and significantly, thanks to his efforts. After ratification, Grant broke from custom to issue a message celebrating the amendment as a measure of grander importance than any other one act of the kind from the foundation of our free government to the present day. By ensuring for former slaves the full political equality inherent in the right to vote, the 15th Amendment was, in some respects, the apex of the most profound changes to the Constitution since the founding period.
The presidency was Grant's only first foray into elected politics. How successful was Grant in political terms?
Consider the uniqueness of Grant's longevity in presidential politics. During the first 50 years and the last 40 years of presidential history, to serve in the nation's highest office for 8 consecutive years was the rule rather than the exception. But during the nearly 150 years that separated Andrew Jackson from Ronald Reagan, that was not the case. Only 4 presidents during that period served 2 complete consecutive terms, and Grant was the only one of them who served in the 19th century. The 19th century presidency after Jackson was a veritable minefield of political and physical peril that usually left presidents either defeated for re-election or unable to attain their party's nomination if they even survived to the end of their terms. In an age in which presidential landslide elections were uncommon, Grant was elected to a second term in 1872 by a wider popular vote margin, 55.6%, than any president between Jackson in 1828 and Theodore Roosevelt's election in 1904, despite facing a candidate endorsed by both the Democratic Party and the breakaway Liberal Republican Party. He even came close to being nominated to a non-consecutive 3rd term in 1880. So his electoral success really stands out.